with us today to talk about innovations in asset management, we have Erko Erola, we have Runik Merorta, and we have John Ney and John Zhu moderating the panel. Thank you, everyone.
Can everybody hear me?
I don't think
It's not
this.
Here we go. Whoa. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So, welcome to Innovations Asset Management. I know this is the name of the panel is asset management, but we're actually going to cover a little more than that because I think to really understand how these asset management vehicles impact financial outcomes of individuals, we're also going to talk a little bit about wealth and the wealth management side. And of course, you know, we work in very regulated industry, so I want to make sure that we cover compliance and how compliance impacts all of this and the innovations for AI and compliance as well. So, you know, I think in the asset management, wealth, and compliance industries, we think of them as like old industries, but it's actually been at the forefront of a lot of adoption for AI, even from the pre-LLM days of like natural language processing, extracting insights from large data sets or high-dimensional data sets. But I think it's obvious to all of us that some recent developments have made it some things discontinuously possible. And so I think to orient us, I'd love to do a couple things. One, let's have the panelists introduce themselves a little bit and what they do, and then I'll set up the prompt for the question. So, John.
Hey, John Ney, founder and CEO of Norm AI. My background's in AI research, did a PhD focused on that, and been focused on, for 11 years now, the intersection of AI and law on the academic side. And at Norm, what we do is we automate regulatory compliance by turning regulations into regulatory AI agents.
Hi, I'm Runik. I'm the co-founder of Vise. We build software for independent financial advisors. We help them build, manage, and explain deeply customized portfolios at scale. We've been in business for about 7 years. We now manage about $4.5 billion and have raised about $130 million of capital.
Erko Erola, CEO and co-founder of Brooklyn Investment Group. We are an AI-powered asset manager serving the financial advisory space and really focused on the operational elements of scaling personalization and tax management across investors. My own background, and I guess that's why I'm wearing a suit jacket here, I was at Goldman Sachs for over 10 years, and some of that, I guess, is still sticking with me. So I guess, John, you were at BlackRock, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
Bring a little bit of the institutional side into the entrepreneurial scene here. But great to be here.
Fantastic. Yes. So I think I'd love for each of you to talk about, and maybe we can, you know, get very concrete. And we were talking about this earlier. Don't worry about getting into the weeds. I think this audience will understand the specifics of it. To take a particular scenario that you think is discontinuously possible now, and what has made it so, and what you've seen in that space. So maybe we'll start from the other end with Erko.
So if you think about really the purpose of asset managers, it's to provide ultimately the personalized service to the end client through typically a financial advisor, right? So if you think about the end client that is looking to maximize the after-tax return of their portfolio, subject to some investment restrictions or preferences, they're going to go to their investment advisor or financial advisor typically, and the financial advisor is going to be like, gosh, like if I have to personalize every portfolio, that's going to constrain my growth, right? And obviously, financial advisors, they're in ultimately the trust building business. They just want to grow their business. And so they go to the asset manager and say, hey, can you help, right? And now the asset manager is kind of like throwing their arms up in the air and they're like, wow, I got to figure out a solution here. Like, how do I basically enable the financial advisor to serve those personalized and tax managed portfolios to each client. So the world we're in today, in other words, it's very different from the world from the middle of the century, 19th century, or 20th century, frankly, where assets would be put in funds. Today, the direction of travel is each individual will have their own separately managed account, right? So the asset manager got to be able to figure that out. So how to basically scale personalized services across clients. And that's where technology comes in. And it's particularly interesting because if you think about the technology that is facing the client, typically like you think about your kind of Chase app, for example, tech is pretty good, right? You go to the wealth management tech, it gets progressively worse. When you look at asset manager tech, it's pretty much blue screens. So I think that's where the opportunity really is. And the asset management industry has to change to basically adapt to the increased demand for personalization and tax management by the end client. And I highlight tax management because that's a really hard optimization problem, but we'll touch upon that later.
Cool. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Erko said. I think on our side, maybe a different framing to what are similar problems. At the end of the day, like the average financial advisor is really a storyteller. Like they're incredibly good at telling a story to their clients. And they've tuned kind of a very specific story over and over and over again. And then they tell that story and that's in some sense what they use to win business. We really believe in China and that's why we bought this fund that invests in China. Or we care a lot about U.S. focus or a focus around value companies. And in some sense, it's a financial story, but the story isn't necessarily what makes the client the most money. It's actually what's the best story or what's the story that advisors most equipped to tell to ultimately their client. And the support on that story is pretty minimal, right? So they have to kind of like wave their hands and tell a story around, hey, this is why we believe in what we do. This is what we think, how we think that could affect you and your life. But today, the actual data that backs that up is somewhat minimal. The interesting thing about large language models and kind of generative AI more broadly is how good it is and how precise it is at these language-oriented or language-related tasks. And this is just a great example of like in financial services, the average person doesn't understand the metrics, the graphs, all of the things that exist in the average kind of asset manager report or wealth management report. And so they need a financial advisor to kind of sit down and explain it to them in layman's terms. Here's what this means for you. Here's why it matters. And in some sense, the entire financial industry is just built on complicating not that complicated things, right? And in some sense, you do that because you want to be able to justify your fees. As an asset manager, you want to make things way more complicated than they actually are, because then I can confuse everybody into paying me 1% a year for 30 years. And in some sense, I think the advent of very cheap reasoning engines that can easily explain this complex stuff that people don't understand in kind of like simple sentences that people do understand, I think puts pressure on that idea of we should make things more complex for the sake of being able to charge higher fees. And so a lot of what we do at Vise is we've kind of manage portfolios via kind of optimization and a bunch of statistical techniques that we've been doing for a long time that maybe is AI that's a little bit more well-traveled and there's a lot more expertise. But then we've really deployed generative models on this kind of explain aspect. How do you help the advisor tell a compelling story to their client that in some sense is backed by evidence and by truth around what's going on in the portfolio, how that affects them in their lives, and then drives it back to their specific goals? And so something we feel strongly about is it's so crazy that financial planning and asset management are these deeply independent things. You go to a financial advisor, they give you a 20-page plan that tells you all of these things about your life, a Monte Carlo simulation, when you're going to retire, how you're going to retire, etc. And then separately, you get this portfolio. And these things are like completely independent. There's no correlation to them. They don't explain how the portfolio really helps you with that financial plan, your specific goals, how you're going to send your kids to college. In some sense, I think a reasoning engine helps fill that gap. And if you have a reasoning engine that can say, hey, I'm going to ingest all of this information that lives in the plan, and I'm going to use that information to then both personalize your portfolio to help solve for that plan, but more important than personalizing the portfolio, give you the story every step of the way on how you're ultimately going to solve that. Hey, this is what's going on in the market, but don't worry, you're still going to be able to retire. Or this is what's going on, and this is why we're changing the portfolio to make sure that you can send your kids to college. In some sense, instead of making it benchmark specific or complex numbers, complex graphs, kind of crystallizing it to a simple set of sentences that people can understand.
So inflection points, that's what we're talking about here?
Yeah, just inflection points and what's made it possible now and what you've seen.
So our entire company in Norm AI was only maybe possible 3 years ago and only very likely possible 18 months ago. And that's because this idea of computational law has been worked on for many decades, primarily at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, where I'm an affiliate researcher. And for a long time, it was limited entirely to really simple contracts because AI was just not good enough to understand what's required for public law and regulation automation. But then GPT-2 came. GPT-1, we didn't quite notice yet, but with GPT-2, before ChatGPT, we were already able to see it could kind of grok legal standards. So that's a huge inflection point in the idea of automating law and computational law, because all the public laws and regulations, at least in the United States and most places, are very standards based. So they're not rules based. They're not if this, then that. Because even if it's like a speed limit thing, it's like, well, was this a reasonable situation to be going over? It's not even if then with speed limits. So basically all of law and policy is very principle based and standards based. And so with traditional AI, with GoFi, if then, a bunch of statements like that, if the if part was just a very simple analysis without a large language model, then you wouldn't be able to capture things like, oh, are you a fiduciary to me, or is this material to a prudent investor? And those are the things that underpin all of regulation. So about 2.5 years ago, this became possible, but it's still, with just a large language model, it's not possible to do it in a way that you can trust and you can actually deploy for compliance in a real world setting. And so that's why what we've done is we've kind of combined together symbolic systems, so an interpretable representation of a regulation in a way that you can see every requirement of the regulation, with large language models where each of the nodes in a decision tree are calls to those models to resolve these things that traditionally required human judgment around these legal standards-based determinations.
Yeah, I want to touch on something that Erko said. I think one of the things that we've all seen, one of the more perhaps lower-hanging fruit and promises of AI, is customization. But the other piece of this is operational efficiency in sort of step functions. We're not talking about sort of iterative efficiency. So I'm wondering if there's been advancements there along the lines of direct indexing, portfolio monitoring, those types of realms. Because, as someone who's built some of these systems in a pre-language model world, I can imagine that there's probably step functions there.
Some of you don't know John's background, but he actually did a lot of what we do today maybe 15 years ago. So kudos to him. But yeah, there has indeed been a big step function in terms of maybe two areas. So cloud compute, everybody knows what that means. But the other thing is use of generative AI models, particularly large language models, as part of basically scaling operational efficiencies. And again, we serve other asset managers as a white label technology stack, right? We also serve financial advisors directly as a sub-advisor, but the important thing is that in order for you to manage each portfolio separately and giving it the full attention, you gotta have better tools at monitoring what's going on, right? So for example, if you have 10,000 portfolios that you're looking after, basically need to interrogate each portfolio every day, basically asking, is there a reason to trade this portfolio today, right? And the reason could be something like, risk management or tax loss harvesting or cash deployment or multiple other things, right? And so today, if you look at the state of the industry, the way this is done is basically each portfolio manager looks after about 1,000 portfolios, right? So every time the asset manager basically onboards another 1,000 clients, they need to shell out another $500,000 to a portfolio manager to look after those portfolios, right? So what we're doing is we're basically giving each portfolio manager scale about 10 times or sometimes even more to basically not only do their jobs better, because humans are not that good at looking at a lot of numbers, right? But also to help them manage more portfolios. And that would not have been possible in the sort of the pre large language model or GPT era. Why is that the case? Well, you could apply your sort of more traditional AI models or machine learning models, but you would never have enough data to actually train those models. Now, what we have found is that if you prompt the AI models in a very thoughtful way, you're actually able to leverage basically a zero-shot approach. So you don't have to give the models training examples, which is just phenomenal. So you're basically in a situation where you have an army of first-year analysts, but instead of those being human beings, they are actually small AI models, right? And that is the big step change that we have seen that frankly enables scalability. And how that affects the end client, well, each client will have a better investment experience as a result.
That would have saved us a lot of time when we were trying to build this 15 years ago. So I think with each successive iteration of technology, particularly in this space, there's always sort of this distribution question. Are different methods of distribution going to be disintermediated? And so I'm curious, Runic, your thoughts on, with indexing solutions replacing some of the existing SMA solutions, do you think there's an opportunity now? And again, this gets asked every time, but do you think there's an opportunity now for direct distribution from asset management? Or is sort of the wealth narrative, customized narrative layer still something that's very valuable to the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that our view is like over and over, kind of there's been this assertion of, oh, financial advisors are going to go away, asset managers are going to go direct. The robo-advisors forum, obviously John built the first version of that and sold it to BlackRock, and so he knows better than anyone. But in some sense, it didn't really work. There are a lot of financial advisors, and they all are much bigger in terms of scale and size than they were when the robo-advisors first started. And so I think the same is going to be true, right? There will probably be a better solution for people who do want to go direct that kind of encompasses not just asset management, which I think in some sense, asset management with the current set of technologies and systems that we have today, can feel somewhat solved for the end consumer. You can customize around their tax preferences. You can customize for restrictions and things they care about. You can give them broad markets exposure. You can even help them represent some of their values and things that are important to them. And there's, a bunch of companies that kind of help do that in a way that scales. But today there still isn't a great place for someone to reason about whether they can afford to send their kid to a certain college or not, or a certain place where they can sit down with a client, with an advisor or technology solution and say, hey, can I retire in Florida, or do I have to retire closer to home? And I think these types of conversations are deeply personal in nature. They're not in some sense the underpinning of them is pretty simple math. It doesn't take AI. They're Monte Carlo simulations, Brownian motion simulations, and sometimes statistical simulations that have been around for much longer. But it's kind of the reasoning that lives on top. So I think what ends up happening is the people who are underserviced, people who can't afford a financial advisor or that financial advisors say no to today, they probably get a better overall offering, because not only do they get kind of somewhat solved asset management, but they get someone to explain to them why they should give a shit about that asset management. Because if you talk to the average person, it's just not something they're that excited or that passionate about. In the financial services industry, I think one of the tropes that we have is we all think that every client wakes up every day thinking about how they should be managing their money, and they just most of them don't really care that much. And in some sense, the job is really getting them to care and getting them to kind of stay invested and interested. And I think if there's like this reasoning engine that lives on top that helps the underserviced get that, I think that that's really valuable. But then I think if you zoom out for like the average person with say $1 million or $10 million that are well serviced by advisors and private wealth management divisions and folks like that, I'm not sure if there's a real incentive for them to like go direct to an asset manager in some sense, because I think the place where the financial advisors provide value is already like, different than just asset management. They're like your best friend. They like help take you to the US Open game. They sit down with your kids and help you understand specific things. Like in some sense, there's like, they're the quarterback for your estate plan. They work with your accountant to take care of those things. And so in some sense, I think that like in a world where like a lot of things get automated with AI, I personally would want to talk to a person about my money if I could. And then that person probably does less. Like they probably spend more time on more relationships, things that are less automatable with AI, and less time like handling your bill pay and paying for rent and these types of things, or, trying to customize a portfolio yourself, or constructing a story and preparing for the client meeting from scratch. My sense is that like AI probably automates a lot of those things. Like you have some mix of agents, or you kind of can break down those problems into very specific like reasoning problems, and then, and then have a chain of large language models solve those today. And then over time, as the models get better, maybe like you can, as Erko was saying, just zero shot like much bigger problems to those LLMs. But I think that like the relationship part, I think just goes down to human preference. Like I would rather have a relationship with a person than with an AI. And maybe 20 years from now that looks different, but today I'd rather have a relationship with a person than an AI. And so I think that gives financial advisors an advantage. But for the underserviced folks, I think, who don't get that relationship, I think things are just going to be better for them.
That makes sense. In talking about customization, I think one thing that this is reminding me of is in matters of compliance, organizations interpret regulatory changes a little bit differently, and there's always sort of specific nuances for regulatory compliance. So I'm curious, John, what have you seen as the important customization for different organizations that may be adopting specific compliance, and what are the specific things that you have to do to facilitate that with whether it's with AI or other traditional methods?
Yeah. So definitely when you are in a regulated industry, especially asset management, the operating principle is that you're supposed to have a compliance program and processes related to that are tailored to your firm and take into account how your firm has certain products, has certain clients. And so even if there's a base regulation, a set of regulations from the SEC and other regulators, you're supposed to really think about it in your own context. And so this is extremely important to us as a company, and it's why we think about it as having a really strong representation of that underlying regulation as a starting point. So from the publicly available material, from the base regulation, the enforcement actions, the additional guidance from the regulators. So we hired a team of lawyers. So we have a whole team from Yale Law School, Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, Columbia Law School, and others. And they practice at places like Sullivan and Cromwell. And so they work on that base level to start with. So they take the regulations, they encode them into a computational form that we've developed. But then that's kind of just the starting point with clients, because then we have to understand for a given firm, how do they interpret the more ambiguous parts of the regulations? And how do they think about their firm-specific disclosures, their firm-specific ways that they communicate with clients? So we onboard all of that in a very customized way, in a personalized way at the firm level. And that allows us to have this sort of firm overlay on top of the base regulation. And we've done this across all different types of firms. Like, so we have a firm level, an industry level, and then a public regulation. So we see private equity, alternatives. It's a little bit different than hedge funds, which is different than asset managers, which is different than broker dealers. So there's 3 layers. There's base public regulation, there's sub-industry, and then there's firm.
That's interesting. So do you end up fine-tuning specific models for each particular nuance or organization, or how would that?
So we actually find it most effective to not actually train large language models. So our architecture is where we have the proprietary part is the representation of the regulation in the firm specific policy. And then as you pointed out, they're kind of reasoning engines. So then we think about large language models, the frontier models in particular from OpenAI and other places like that, as kind of general reasoners that are really smart but have like no context about anything. And so what we do is we have the representation of either the public regulation or the firm specific policy in the form of a decision tree, and it can be extremely complicated, but it's interpretable. So it'll have like 100 nodes. Each node are the calls to the large language model. And so the way we answer your question, the way we tailor it to the firm is when you're inside a given firm, you now have that base regulation and it knows, okay, I'm inside this large private equity firm and I know that here I'm going to call upon that firm's specific interpretation of that one little node, that one part of that one regulation, and then it pulls that into context and then moves forward. So that allows us to have something that's modular, so we can always be pulling in and testing new underlying foundation models. We can be updating the underlying public regulation representation, but at the same time, we don't have to retrain a model. So when there's a new change at that specific firm, it's not from scratch and we don't know how it's all going to work out.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's, I think, pretty obvious to see that even within the last 6 months, the models in chain of thought reasoning, like all of the current advancements have created such a powerful base to work off of for a lot of this. Shifting gears a little bit, I think, while that is possible, while that's shown a lot of the industry that we work in, the no limit bounds of what's possible now. It's also raised a lot of questions around data governance, around how, reasons to go slower in the adoption of these technologies. I'm curious what you've seen as sort of the main barriers to larger organizations adopting these types of solutions. And maybe we'll start with Erko on that.
Well, my answer is going to be very simple. It's the mere fact that most large organizations in the financial services space still do not have an AI policy, right? And so they kind of need to get that in place before they can adopt models, particularly on the portfolio management side. I don't know, John, your experience on the compliance side, but when you're talking about a fiduciary responsibility of a portfolio manager and them using AI powered tools, the company better have an AI policy in place so that everybody understands what that really means. And that's something that we've seen as the biggest sort of impediment to adoption. And typically the way we deal with those types of situations, we then start with a more sort of a rules-based, more traditional process. And the portfolio managers, they're always like super eager to get to the AI-powered stuff. But again, they're compliance officers. We kind of like knock them on the shoulder and say like, not yet.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think that's exactly right. I think for us, like, our learning has been, in some sense, like, when you think about these asset management firms, like if I'd play devil's advocate, like what incentive do they really have to adopt AI? Like until their businesses are about to die, like why would they do that? Like it's easier for like the people at those firms to like take meetings with AI companies and like say they really like AI and like talk about AI on like panels and conferences than actually like change the DNA of the company to try to operate that way. And so in some sense, I think that like over time, this business is going to get harder and harder and harder. The margins are going to be squeezed. They already are. Like there's huge fee compression. There's huge kind of commoditization of asset management broadly. And so I think when they have to, in some sense, the business has to evolve or die, the ones that will die, and the ones that will evolve. And I think that's when you start to see real adoption in the industry. But I also think that there's like a good reason to not adopt generative AI in this space, in that like you have especially with such an aggressive kind of regulatory landscape that we live in right now, with the chair of the SEC and their current position, like your kind of like failure rate is roughly zero. It's not so different from self-driving cars in some sense that like the problem is like regulatory and trust more than it is like a solution, right? Like self-driving in some sense was like a semi-solved problem from a technical perspective years ago. But in some sense, it's some mix of regulatory plus data that like has gotten everybody comfortable in actually doing it. So I would say like, and this is the opposite of my first point, but like asset managers also have a reason to be skeptical when it comes to generative models and generative AI, because in some sense, like they do have real hallucination risk. There is kind of like real failure risks. And as much as like you can say that like you're trying to account for those things, nobody can guarantee these models will not hallucinate. So you have to do a lot of work around compliance. You have to do a lot of work around building like both manual filters and even like generative AI that like reasons about things that maybe one of these models has sprouted out. But the average asset management firm is probably pretty concerned about, well, I have an SEC that says I can't do, this has to be 100% accurate. And I have a company that's trying to sell to me that says I can't guarantee that it's going to be 100% accurate. And so outside of do nothing, I'm not sure what the asset manager does. And I think Urko brought up a good point. Maybe what they do is they start with small amounts of AI and they start to get comfortable. And then over time, they build trust with regulators and everyone starts to trust this more and more and more. And then they start to adopt kind of more meaningful amounts of AI across the business.
You ready to take this?
Yeah. I'm really curious, particularly from a compliance angle, because I think there's, and I wonder. I'll throw the food for thought out there. I wonder if there are sort of compliance, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a just corporate compliance standpoint, things that we can do to ease that adoption. But love to hear your perspective.
Yeah. So, well, one thing is that as AI gets better and better, then we all envision the potential, I think, here for it to be relatively autonomous in the things that it's trying to accomplish. So whether that's creating a plan, putting a plan together, whether that's eventually some sort of trading. So when that happens, though, everything that a human does inside a company is subject to a ton of laws and regulations, especially in this space. And so those don't go away at all. And to your point, I mean, if anything, it's worse. So I think what that requires is over time is we're trying to deploy AI to be doing more things like a human is doing inside a company, then you actually need other AI systems to be checking them and to say, okay, I as a specialized AI system have an understanding of the relevant laws and regulations for this particular application inside this company. And so I'm going to act as that guardrails, and I'm going to check proactively before it comes out of the original system, the system that's trying to accomplish the business goal. I'm going to check it and say, okay, here's the relevant regulations to what is trying to be done here. Is this consistent with that or not? If not, maybe kick it back for another try for the original base system. And if it is, then move forward and log that and have that be audited. But of course, that second system still is under a ton of scrutiny, right? So I think it comes back to saying, I have a firm specific understanding of my obligations, and I've put in very reasonable best practices to implement that in my firm. And of course, there's, even if it's autonomous vehicles, if your rate is like 0.0001%, and with humans, it's an order of magnitude more deaths with those vehicles, you're held to a higher standard. But if you can show very systematically that you've ahead of time put in so many guardrails and have benchmarked it across as many things as possible that are relevant to your firm, then in some ways you're actually showing that you're going above and beyond. You're saying, I'm doing what is more than humanly possible from a compliance perspective now that I've adopted this. So that puts you in a good place when you have to have some harder conversations.
Yeah, as a follow-up, I think I've been asked this a lot. Do you think there's value in creating sort of an industry standard for those guardrails, like whether it's a process standard or some sort of regulatory standard around, call it SOC 2 for AI or something like this?
So I think that would make a lot of sense if AI kind of stayed where it is today. I think that would make a ton of sense if AI is always a not so great co-pilot. But once AI goes even just a little bit more, and where it might be in December of this year, from one of the sponsors of this conference, then I think it'll be at a point where it starts to make sense to think about it a little bit more in the framing that I just said, to say, okay, there's not one standard. There's literally a million regulations in the United States. So there's a million standards. And so if an AI is doing things in a way that is similar to how a human's doing things, then we actually need to figure out a way to apply a million things instead of one.
Yeah, I would say call me European, but I think that regulations are good in terms of how we should think about things. But like, I agree with you. It's hard to regulate something when the puck is moving so quickly. But I would say that like in some sense, over time, you have to regulate these models in some sense like people, in that they're principles based, and judgment based rules, rather than necessarily kind of like a black and white if then. And because I think it's like, these models have a world model that is inspired by the human model of thinking, operating, that exists kind of in Common Crawl and the internet, etc. And so I think like whether we like it or not, we've imputed a lot of human behavior into these models and how they think and how they operate and the specific decisions they make and the outputs that exist. And in some sense, like we have a pretty decent, there are some failures, but we have a pretty decent way to regulate and set rules for people across, different segments and sectors. And I think in sense, like what's going to happen is over time, we have to think about those ways that are different for how we regulate kind of like these AI models, but the same inspiration, right? In like low risk industries, you have lower regulation. It's much easier to get a real estate license to sell someone a home than an investment license, right? To be able to go sell them securities. And I think that that's on purpose, right? I think in some sense, like it is lower risk to sell someone a home than a set of securities. And therefore the standards for AI models in real estate, to empower real estate agents or replace real estate agents probably should be lower than the standard of AI models in the security space, which should probably also be lower than the standard for AI models in medicine and diagnosis and surgery. So in some sense, I think not so different from people, you scale it based on the person and then the required experience or capabilities, as well as like the risk of a person dying, a person losing a lot of money, or maybe a person getting swindled into a home they don't love.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with you guys. And the other thing, I think, John, you said it was these models are quickly evolving into a phase where they're doing more than what is humanly possible, right? And so even, I used to work at the New York Fed during the financial crisis, and it was very clear that regulation is always behind what's going on in the world, right? So like, what is the system that can regulate the newer and newer AI models that are doing more than is humanly possible already?
So I'm curious, what are the biggest gaps right now that you see? I think we talked a little bit about accuracy and mitigating some of those risks. Is better interpretability or better eval tools like those, are those the kind of the main gaps? Or are there other gaps to really create better accuracy?
Yeah, I would say, I think on my side, I think it's definitely the evaluations and benchmarks. And I'm curious, especially how you guys think about this, Norm, because I agree in some sense, like the foundational models are like general purpose reasoning engines, and different models may actually make more sense in different use cases. And so it's in some sense like trying to think about this purely at the model level is a mistake. And this is kind of how we thought about it in AI previously, which is like, I am trying to solve a language problem. I have a model, and like the way I'm going to improve accuracy in the long term, or the way I'm going to measure this model, is I have a data set, I have a train and test set. Take 80% of it, I throw it through a model to train, and then I have the other 20% left that I'm going to ultimately test to determine some sort of score of how good is this model. And then I make some changes to the code and I run it again, and I get a different set of kind of like how good is it doing on this test set. In some sense, that we have to build the same thing, but for the entire kind of infrastructure, not the model itself. So it's the model, it's all the prompting, it's like everything that exists. You have to test that entire infrastructure against kind of like a very valuable, much more meaningful test data set that like today just doesn't exist. We don't have any of these test data sets. And so I think that there probably has to be a lot of work into building these like human or synthetic human sets of testing that we feel good about, and then putting the entire end-to-end process through that testing, such that when I edit each aspect of the process, like I'm going to change the prompt, or I'm going to, like, one of the things that's so funny is if you tell a model, think step by step, or if you give it a persona, right? There's a lot of research that shows that this improves the accuracy of the underlying output. And so that's not a model itself. It's not data. It's literally like words you put in the prompt. It's soft prompt tuning. And so in some sense, you want to be able to understand, like, as I tune the prompt, as I pick a different model, as I put different data in as maybe one-shot or two-shot examples, or if I change the order of operations of the chain of models I'm using, how does that ultimately, is that good or is that bad? And I think right now most people are just trying and seeing what happens. I don't know if we have like a really great system today or enough infrastructure to get this right. But I think that, like, there is investment. I think people are investing in this, and this might actually be what differentiates some companies from others, is that they invest in their own testing infrastructure, and that's very industry specific. And then they don't open source that. And that's like kind of what makes them good at tuning and improving these models to the specific use cases they have, because they have in some sense some IP in that ability to test.
Yeah, I think we're running very low on time, so I'm gonna just round this up with one final question for each of you. Same question, which is, let's fast forward sort of 10 years from now. What do you see as the state of asset management or wealth management and compliance in your particular part of the industry? And maybe the prompt here is, are humans still there, or 99% of the human process is already removed?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by saying that I think the progress in AI is going to benefit the most those people who are either in a high stakes sales process or trust building, any sort of human connection. And we see this in the wealth management space all the time. So the hardest thing ultimately to displace is going to be that financial advisor who's been playing golf with that same client for the past 25 years. AI is never going to be able to build that trust the same way. So basically, it's those types of trust building jobs that will benefit the most from evolution in AI, basically giving them more leverage in what they're really good at and what machines cannot do. So that's sort of one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is ultimately we are in the financial services space, and there is the fiduciary duty resting with the portfolio manager. And again, I think we're very far from a place where that portfolio manager would get completely displaced by a machine. But again, that portfolio manager will be able to leverage all of the machines and the models that are really better at doing the number crunching and the monitoring and those highly operational tasks. So I think like the big evolution just over the next year or two is going to be really taking a lot of that operational overhead and automating it away. 10 years from now, gosh, I was just talking to a friend of mine at Anthropic, and he's pretty scared about the world even like 5 years from now, let alone 10. So maybe we'll have that conversation next year's panel.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would say that 10 years in some sense is a long time. I like, Vinod Khosla, who founded Khosla Ventures, is this very interesting analogy where his point is that he thinks the future of medicine is that ultimately AI and technology does everything. Does the diagnosis, does the core work, does the core surgery, and then the doctors are just actors. And their job is to act. Their job is to, in some sense, if you have a cancer diagnosis, you don't want to hear that from a screen that pops out. You want to hear that from a person who sits you down and kind of makes you feel heard and says, hey, like, this is something that's going to really change in your life. And so in some sense, I think that if I had to think 10 years out, like, I'm not convinced we have a huge compliance team at Vise. I think we're probably all using John's software, and like, there's one or two people who are overseeing it and making sure that things look good. But in some sense, like, my view would be financial advisors are going to be really tough to replace, but they're going to become actors. Portfolio managers are going to become actors. Like, everyone in some sense over a 10-year time frame, they will be actors. Their job is the emotional component. And this is assuming that, like, as people, we want to interact with other people. Like, this is a fundamental assumption. I hope that's true. Like, I think that the world's going to look really, really weird if that's not true. But I hope what's true is that, even if we could choose between interacting with a person and interacting with technology, in a physical sense, we're going to want to interact with a person over, maybe personified technology. And therefore, I think about over a 10-year time scale in any industry, but especially our industry, especially at the pace we're moving, is that the people kind of live at this layer, this like acting layer on top, and technology does most of the core work.
So we when we're thinking about like as this evolves in the coming years, there's a fixed right now amount of basically things to do from compliance. Like there's a certain amount of content being produced. There's a certain amount of employee activity to supervise. So there's relatively fixed amount. If AI is over the next 10 years really getting as good as Anthropic thinks it will, then there's going to actually be a lot more to check. There's going to be like a lot more to supervise. There's going to be a lot more extremely personalized content being shown to everybody. There's going to be a lot more fully personalized plans being shown to everybody. So there's more work to be done in terms of work. And so from the compliance side, but to the extent that more and more of that can be done automatically, at least on the first pass, and at least to the extent that then you do ultimately still do have a human, as we all agree, supervising those AIs that are doing those compliance tasks, that will enable that other stuff to happen. So those other things can actually be deployed to add more personalization, more value to everybody else's lives.
With that, I want to thank John, Runic, and Erko for joining us. Round of applause. And thank you as well. I invite everyone to continue the conversation with us offline, online. Come find us. All right. Thanks.